Yo, what is up, y'all? My name is Robert Donaldson, and welcome back to another edition of Hawkeye Breakdown. And in this video, we are talking about Iowa versus Iowa State, the Cy-Hawk football rivalry game. And this is definitely coming from an Iowa football fan perspective, to be clear. So we're going to be talking about Mark Gronowski and his debut, the game plan for Iowa State, and whether or not Iowa can actually even win this game in Ames. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right in here. Going into this game, it's impossible to avoid the obvious sort of layout of the season so far, which is Iowa State has already played 2 games. One against Kansas State, one against South Dakota, and they handled business both times. But for Iowa, they have played a game. It was against Albany, I get it. And people might look at that comparison of, both schedules to date so far and say, well, Iowa State is far more battle-tested, right? And maybe Iowa was only successful in what they ran because of the team that they were playing on the other side. And although I think that's a fair assessment to an extent, man, play design is still play design. Scheme is still scheme. And a good game plan is still a good game plan at the very end of the day. Not every play that Iowa ran and had success with was because Albany just had, inferior players. The FCS isn't high school, and opposing defenders will still move where you want them to if your play design, offensively or defensively, manufactures that to be the case. Now, there are going to be certain guys that are talented enough to win on any given play, obviously, and, it doesn't matter about position. It doesn't matter about what the play call is. It doesn't matter about, anything if it gets defended well or if everything breaks down fundamentally. And obviously this rivalry has seen a number of those guys over the years, from Jalen Knoll to Caleb Johnson to Noah Fant, so on, so forth. Those are the game breakers in a game. And there's a number of guys that I think have that potential this season as well. And one of those guys that we're going to talk about here first, and I know it didn't kind of look like it in week 1 or in game 1 rather, but we're talking about Mark Gronowski. And with Mark, it's impossible to avoid the obvious here, and that obvious is that Mark Gronowski did not play well in week 1. And it wouldn't matter if it was his, first start or his 50th start. It just wasn't objectively a good showing out of Mark. And Mark himself has owned that. He's 100% come out after the game and said, listen, I was a little bit nervous. I was a little bit fast. It was just my first game in the black and gold. I wanted to play well, and things out the gate just didn't go my way. Now, instead of just jumping on the guy and highlighting some awkward throws or poor throws and talking about how terrible it looked and how it might be the worst in Iowa history, let's actually sit in the pocket with him and get down to the root issue of what went wrong. And right away here on drive 1, we've got a play that I think perfectly encapsulates Mark's struggles right out of the gate. And this is drive number 1, play number, I believe 3 or 4. I could be wrong on that. And this was the first play where I immediately said to myself, it's far too early in the game for 3 progressions. It looked like from just watching live, 3 progressions that just were not there. And looking back on it, I was 100% right, because here's the thing. Progressions are a quarterback's work schedule, right? Not to be cliche, but if you have a meeting at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, you better be at that meeting at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, unless the client cancels, right? And for the sake of comparisons, a client canceling would be akin to a defender being in good position to cancel out that progression. And on this play, 1, 2, and 3 are all wide open, and Mark just never shows up. It can't happen. If number 1 is there, the ball is out to number 1. If number 2 is there, the ball is out to number 2. You can fail. You have a fail safe. If you miss a progression, there's that second progression in the tree, but you've got to hit it. And instead, Mark just bails. Now, this is a very clear sign out the gate that to Mark's very own point, he might have been working too fast, potentially a little too nervous. And if you ask social media, they might be convinced after watching this play and through all their opinions out over the weekend that he might have the yips or he's gun shy, but I'm not putting that shit on Mark after one game, let alone one play, especially on his very first drive. So let's transition to the next play that really stood out to me when watching Mark back here. And with this play, man, this is just a big play on a platter, and Mark flat out misses it. And going back to progressions, number one is wide open, and this is a motherfucking touchdown every day of the week and twice on Saturday. And now, listen, Mark does make a good progression, going away from number 2 on this play to find the check down with number 3, but this is what I haven't been able to stand about a lot of Iowa QBs over the past decade is, you're just wasting a big play. This is a great play design by Tim Lester, and instead of, getting a touchdown here, really pushing the ball downfield, we get a 2-yard check down because, a lot of times it comes down to the confidence factor of a lot of the Iowa QBs or just the inability to push it down the field. But again, Mark, to his own admission, was kind of working a little bit fast in the early set of this game, and I do feel like, again, this is a really good example of it. And this can't happen against Iowa State. You can't miss the touchdowns that are presented to you. You just can't. And yes, as we're going through all these games, or all throughout these plays, rather, there were some less nuanced and just surface level, bad plays, like the floated check down to his running back on drive 1, which, ironically, he actually did make the correct judgment here to go to the check down. It's just that the edge defender was in his sight line, and instead of kind of, sidestepping or trying to find a passing angle, he just weirdly floats it, and it just looks completely awkward. And then we have the big one, right? We're in the red zone. Mark misses another touchdown, and on that play, he was late, he was out of rhythm, and when he finally pulled the trigger and it came out of his hand, it was inexplicably off target, and it falls well short of the receiver he's throwing to, which, again, a wide open touchdown. You can't have that against Iowa State. The touchdowns that are presented to you, you need to take advantage of. But, I'm not going to kill Mark for one game. And honestly, after these plays, yes, there were some other plays where it did look like he was missing progressions, wasn't really throwing it to the guy that he should have been throwing it to. But at the same time, I know that this is Albany. This is week 1. This is a ramp-up period. There are some nerves when you're playing your first game for your new team. It's like going to school for the first time and seeing all these classmates and people around you, and you have no idea who they are. Well, there was 80,000 of them, inside Kinnick Stadium looking at Mark in this game. But, hey, from a process standpoint, it couldn't have been much worse for Mark Gronowski in game 1. And at the end of the day, too, this is still an experienced veteran QB who I am optimistic will get into a rhythm over the next week here. And when you're looking at the overall game plan against Albany and how that can potentially translate to a team like an Iowa State, Tim Lester was in his bag early as it pertains to motions in the run game, getting defenders off their keys, and it truly looked like we were running 2010s Wisconsin with Melvin Gordon, Monty Ball, all those boys back in the mix there, and everybody was flying around pre-snap. They were getting involved in the ground game, and they were getting involved in the play-action game as well, and we've already seen those types of plays and those types of setups pay serious dividends against Iowa State for Kansas State when they were going up against them in Dublin. And as it pertains to getting Iowa State safeties and linebackers out of their run fits, I really do think that Iowa has a serious advantage because I don't necessarily know if they're actually quality players. From the early looks of things, it does feel like one of the more truly susceptible areas of Iowa State's team. Now, to really sell those motions and have success, Iowa's going to need to be able to sell the pass on these motion players, or rather to these motion players, and they did that in week 1 in a very, very limited sample before things really got buttoned up. I don't think Tim Lester was trying to show too much, but was trying to get it ramped up for, what this kind of felt like in a game setting for his own offense. And, as it pertains to, throws across the field from the far hash, which we saw a ton of from Iowa in this game, what that essentially is supposed to do is it's going to force Iowa State or force a defense to space out more than what they would like to do to cater to stopping that action. Now, you got to hit those throws, and Iowa didn't have a lot of success in that in week 1 because, again, I don't want to harp on this too much, but there were some missed throws. The skip pass to Seth Anderson that got overturned. There were a couple other ones that were kind of off target, didn't really do much in terms of yardage gained, but I do expect that to be a big part of the game plan against Iowa State, just to keep those players honest rather than have them crashing on the line of scrimmage every single play. And the other element at play here for offensively for Iowa was that their offensive line looked absolutely fantastic. Yes, there were some shaky zone exchanges, and also notably a player that I really, really like. I think he just had a bad game, kind of like Mark. Zach Ortworth. He missed some crucial blocks when lined up in line, but for the most part, Dunker, Piper, Jones, Locke, Stevens, Dotzler, so many great moments to choose from in this game. And I get it, Iowa State is going to be a step up in terms of the talent lined up across from them, and it's also going to be a different looking front as opposed to what Albany runs just from a scheme perspective. But man, I do feel like what we saw was so translatable. These guys aren't just new to the program either, so a lot of this is kind of building on what we already know from them from years past, and I couldn't be more excited when you're talking about the effectiveness or the potential effectiveness for Iowa's ground game to really gash Iowa State early and often in this game. Now, we've talked about the positives and the negatives with Iowa's offense so far, but the real determinator of this game is actually going to be on the other side of the ball, right? This is what happens every single year. We talk up the offensive side of Iowa or Iowa State and think that, hey, that's the side that's going to be able to dictate how this game goes. And in some years, sure, that ends up being the case, but 90% of the time, the Iowa defense or the Iowa State defense is what ultimately is going to win out. And last season, Iowa's defense was playing a really phenomenal game outside of just a few big plays. And in the second half, notably, Rocco Becht in that passing attack that featured Jaden Higgins, Jalen Knoll, they were able to move the ball down the field on Iowa in chunks. And ultimately, that's what set up the game-winning field goal for Iowa State. Now, when you are looking at this team, obviously they have turned over a few of their starters at the wide receiver position. No more Jalen Knoll. No more Jaden Higgins. Rocco Becht is still in the fold, and let me tell you, they've added a lot of similar molds to what they lost in Higgins and Knoll because they got the burners. They got the quick sort of tweener types that don't have a true NFL type of body, but have that true NFL type of athleticism that you notice right out the gate. And they really picked up some steam last week against South Dakota. Against Kansas State in Dublin, it looked really shaky early on, but again, you got to kind of factor in the fact that they were jumping over to a different country. They were also playing in the rain. It was week 0. We just kind of saw Mark Gronowski go through it. They were kind of going through it in their own way against a team in Kansas State who's actually very, very respectable. And now we're kind of looking at this matchup with Iowa State's new revamped passing attack going up against Iowa's defensive back core. And I do feel like Iowa's defensive backs have a really good leg up, and at least in the early goings of this game, because Deshaun Lee, you can kind of poke holes in him because of his size, but he's great at positioning. He's super athletic. Because of that small frame, he can really easily, fluidly transition between his breaks. And on the other side, TJ Hall, a ton of upside, especially when you're talking about the athleticism side of things. He is a very sticky man cover guy, especially when he's playing that trail technique. And I do feel like if he can really grow into that next level of, hey, not just be in good position, but actually make a play on the football more often than not, we're going to be talking about a guy who could be really up there in terms of corners in the Big Ten. Now, they're busting out Cohen Intriger. Xavier and Wonkpa are kind of playing two different positions right now in terms of what they've experienced over past years, and we'll see how that really kind of comes to fruition because Albany didn't push the ball a whole lot down the field. That will 100% be what Rocco Becht in this Iowa State passing attack try to do in this game, but notably, the biggest advantage for Iowa in this game is going to come on the defensive line, where I think Iowa can truly rotate in and out 5 or 6 guys and have a lot of success. They have a lot of athleticism on that front four as well. And when you are looking at that dynamic of going up against Iowa State's offensive line specifically, we've already seen Kansas State have a ton of success in running, these TE stunts, meaning the D tackle is crashing outside, the D end is barreling inside, and even the reverse has also been very successful out the gate. Now, Iowa State has been dealing with some injuries on the offensive line, but that's not an excuse, right? That's still something that they're going to be dealing with in this game because they haven't had that proper ramp-up period. And I do feel like every single time when we watch this game with Iowa going up against Iowa State, it's Iowa's defensive line setting a mean, nasty tone in the early goings. Now, the other side of that coin is Iowa is busting out a couple new linebackers when you're looking at Carson Sherrar and Jaden Harrell in particular. They got the most run against Albany, and there were a lot of shaky plays, a lot of missed tackles, some bad run fits, and notably when you're watching this play right here, this is why I was highlighting Tim Lester's motions in the run game, because watch, Carson Sherrar, he's, I guess, relatively in a good position, but when those motions are going on, you're moving side to side, you don't have a good feel of kind of, being set and being able to just explode out of a static position. That's what motion does. It keeps you off of your run fits, or at least foggies them up, gets you thinking about other things, and guess what? Iowa State is going to hit Iowa with a number of those motions as well, and it's just going to come down to, hey, can Jaden Harrell, can Carson Sherrar, can they fill the right gap because of those motions and then actually make the play on the ball? I have a lot of questions when it comes down to that, and that's why I do think this needs to be a complete team effort from the back end as well. When you are talking about Cohen Intriger, Xavier and Wonkpa, they had some good moments filling in on the backside, being that alley defender to sort of crash in on the edge, but that's not always going to work out, especially when, again, these motions sort of foggy up the keys and you do end up being isolated in the alley with an athletic player like Abu Sama. So, again, this is going to be taking a very interesting approach in terms of how Iowa is going to win in this matchup, but it does start on the front four. It does start at the quarter spots and just holding those positions down. And I do feel like Iowa is in a really great position if the offense can hold up their end of the bargain as well, specifically with the rushing attack. And ultimately, when you're looking at the full scale of this game, I do feel like Iowa has a somewhat edge. Now, this is being played in Ames, and that's what kind of murkies up this thing in terms of factoring in that outside atmospheric pressure, because we just saw Mark Gronowski struggle, and he was at home, playing in front of home crowd fans, and he was clearly ramped up a little bit too fast. But I do feel like with that sort of first start out of the gate, under his belt, ready to go, I think we're going to see the best version of Mark Gronowski here in week 2, and I do think that's what ends up sealing this game for Iowa. I think it's going to be a great game. I think it's going to come down to a lot of different factors for Iowa State. It's about keeping their run fits. And for Iowa, similar thing. It's about keeping their run fits. Now, I do feel like Iowa has a better advantage on that side of things just because of the front 4 or even front 5 that they can kind of feature on any given snap. But man, this is going to be a really fun battle. And it's just going to be coming down to, I think, a few different plays throughout the game that this game always comes down to. But in the end, give me Iowa 23-20. I do think we see a couple touchdowns come off the board, and ultimately I think this is going to be a game that is won in the red zone with Mark Gronowski's running attack, with the Iowa running game, and the ability of Iowa's defense to kind of hold serve in that area. But with all that being said, y'all, I appreciate the hell out of you guys for tuning into this video. It was a blast making it. It's been a blast watching Iowa football over the past, my goodness, 11, 12 years. This is where it all started, right? I have my main channel, but this is kind of the channel that I've devoted now to all the Iowa content that I like to pump out here and now, or now and then rather. But I appreciate you guys for tuning in. Go Hawks, and let's see if the Iowa Hawkeyes can't bring home the trophy from Ames and kind of get revenge on what happened to them last season.